Teacher and pre-service teacher perception on the benefits of explicit teaching in the classroom.
By Chris Solway,
Annabelle Cox,
Diana Nguyen,
and Sarah Diab. Firstly, we will discuss the literature that we researched in order to inform our individual questions.
Secondly, we will explain the data action protocols that were considered when designing our research methods.
Thirdly, we will go into detail regarding the overall findings on both of our surveys and both of our focus groups.
Finally, we will discuss potential future projects and the action research cycle as a whole.
Explicit teaching in schools can be broken down into 4 different areas: how current teachers understand explicit teaching, strategies to assist implementation, how it can be implemented online, and how explicit teaching impacts student behaviour. The necessity for teachers to make their teaching explicit is being highlighted as an important aspect teachers should implement in the classroom. Teachers have found that using explicit strategies in teaching has consistently been effective over other approaches. Resources are offered to teachers and schools across Australia to support and enhance the application of explicit teaching. However, studies continue to provide evidence that implicates that explicit teaching is inadequately being implemented. Research conducted through the US and UK identified that university graduates were graduating without the understanding of explicit and critical teaching strategies. However, there are various explicit teaching strategies that can be implemented. Modelling or guided instruction is one of the most prominent strategies with regard to explicit teaching, and is the act of providing guided examples using simple, unambiguous, and consistent instructional language. Research suggests that the guided instruction is especially beneficial when students are attempting to solve complex problems. Clearly defining learning intentions requires clearly defining to the students the goal of the lesson and the relevance of the learning or skill that is being taught. Ongoing practice and corrective feedback is another explicit teaching technique that is effective in improving student outcomes with consistent student practice and timely corrective feedback. There is some debate, however, with regards to the effectiveness of using guided teaching strategies on expert or high ability learners. In regard to a setting that is not in the classroom, explicit education in an online environment may be delivered through explicit video modelling, which can provide greater depth or variance of explanation for students who struggle with remote concept development online. This incorporates deliverance of education to diverse student learning needs. This can also be done by providing a scaffold to address their specific question type and then explaining how to effectively use the scaffold in solving the question. When practically implicating explicit teaching, a clear emphasis on student comprehension must be addressed with detailed follow-up such as why or why not questions. Otherwise, the teaching is not entirely explicit. However, the current limitations of online explicit teaching is that there is a lack of studies in this area. When looking at the effects of explicit teaching on improving critical thinking of students, a report by the Centre of Education Statistics and Evaluation in New South Wales Department of Education and Communities showed that integrating explicit teaching evidenced higher learner performances and excellent teaching attributes. These programs were integrated into primary and high schools and proved to improve teacher and student outcomes through practical instructional pedagogies. Other studies also demonstrated that explicit teaching involves challenging assessments or curricular frameworks, invoking a student's ability for problem solving.
In approaching explicit teaching, we decided to categorize it into 4 core topics: how teachers and pre-service teachers understand explicit teaching, what are some strategies teachers can employ to assist with explicit teaching, how can explicit teaching happen via online learning, and what are the effects of explicit teaching on improving critical thinking among students. When approaching this, the surveys were done on point 1 and point 4, while the other 2 were used in focus groups. The group decided that the data collecting procedure would revolve around getting pre-service teachers and teachers as participants for our research. Ethical procedures are put in place to guarantee the privacy of everyone participating in the data gathering methodology. Individuals will not be required to input any personal information about themselves when taking the survey or in attendance with the focus groups. Before the focus groups or surveys are started, informed consent will be acquired in the survey's opening statement, which participants must affirm or sign. In the slide shown, here is an example of a consent form done for a survey and a focus group within our research. If participants refuse to recognize the rules of the surveys or focus group, their replies would not be included in the data collection, as this would raise ethical concerns. Upon acknowledgement and providing consent, we would then proceed in conducting the survey or focus group. The survey method for both researchers in our group was conducted quite similarly. The goal was to get an even amount of pre-service teachers and teachers to participate. In this instance, we had a total of 8 participants, 4 pre-service teachers and 4 teachers involved, allowing for fair comparison against the two. Consent was approached in 2 slightly different methods. Both were sent out via email, where the Google Forms required an acknowledgement before proceeding with the Google form or signing a consent form for the other survey. In regards to the survey, how teachers and pre-service teachers understand explicit teaching, you can observe the acknowledgement before they could proceed with the Google form, as well as the 9 questions asked on the Google Forms. When approaching the effects of explicit teaching on improving critical thinking among students, a survey was sent out in the form of a Likert scale. A Likert scale is often widely used as a study tool to evaluate one's attitude. With this Likert scale, along with the Google Forms, it allowed for a quantitative assessment of the results. Due to the survey method already being a quantitative measure, it was decided upon that the focus groups would be a good way to qualitatively gather data. Not only that, but focus groups were chosen as a data collecting approach because it allowed participants to stimulate and expand on other comments, and not only that, but to increase the possibility of unique ideas. To be fair between the 2 researchers, a minimum of 4 participants involving teachers were agreed upon. In regards to the focus group observing strategies teachers could employ with explicit teaching, there was 4 general questions asked where the researcher would then summarize the participant responses and create general themes. The qualitative data was gathered from 4 current Australian primary or secondary teachers who would be knowledgeable about explicit teaching. The researcher conducting the focus group on how explicit teaching can happen via online learning conducted very similarly to the previous researcher. There was questions where responses and themes would also be noted down. In this particular focus group, there was a minimum of 5 teacher participants.
Across all 4 data collection methods, almost all teacher participants felt they understood what explicit teaching was and were able to identify key ideas that were important to implementing it in the classroom. Pre-service teachers from Survey 2 likewise felt they understood what the practice of explicit teaching entailed, which does not align with LCPNC's study, though this may be attributed to the small sample size of our study. Some of the consistent terms and phrases that were found in the survey responses include the need for explicit teaching to be direct, precise, target specific learning goals, and make obvious to the students why the learning is significant. Across both focus groups, teachers were able to speak in depth regarding how to apply explicit teaching in their classrooms, and the benefits/limitations of the concept was in line with the previous discussed literature. Aside from wanting to know whether teachers and pre-service teachers were familiar with explicit teaching, our overall research question was also interested in finding out whether teachers believed that explicit teaching could be effective regardless of the mode of delivery or goal of the lesson. All 4 of the educators in Focus Group 1 agreed that explicit teaching should be used in their classrooms, primarily when introducing students to new content, though all lessons would benefit from some direct instruction, learning intentions, and success criteria. Other themes that were extracted from the data include how, regardless of ability level, the direct instruction portion of the lesson remains the same, and it is during the check for understanding part of the lesson where teachers should decide when to move on to more independent learning. Even though the participants of Focus Group 1 overwhelmingly agreed that explicit teaching should be incorporated to some degree in every lesson, the participants from Survey 1 and Focus Group 2 had contrasting ideas. Focus Group 2, which was primarily focused on the impact of remote learning, discussed the need to have a variety of tactics in every online lesson and the difficulties of keeping students engaged. Participants from Focus Group 2 discussed how inquiry-based and student-centered learning were more beneficial during remote learning, as students were generally more interested in and motivated. Other concerns that emerged from Focus Group 2 regarding whether explicit teaching was appropriate for remote learning included having insufficient time and being unsure whether the strategy was working effectively. Some of these apprehensions could be explained due to limited communication between teachers and students that occurs during remote teaching, which was identified by Focus Group 1 as an important component when knowing when to scale back explicit teaching and incorporate more self-regulating learning. Without having face-to-face interactions with students, teachers would struggle to gauge when their students were understanding the content and when to slowly release control. With regards to specific strategies being implemented, participants from Focus Group 2 discussed how learning intentions and success criteria were still being employed during remote learning. However, as noted by Reid and the participants from Focus Group 1, simply flashing the learning intentions on a PowerPoint presentation is not enough for them to be considered explicit teaching. Instead, there needs to be a meaningful conversation with students regarding the intentions and consistent reference back to the success criteria throughout the lesson. These features would be undoubtedly more difficult in remote learning. The results from Survey 1 also highlighted some issues that teachers had with implementing explicit teaching. However, this time the focus was on how explicit teaching could be used to develop critical thinking skills. When asked if explicit teaching strategies were the most effective method to teach critical thinking, only 37% agreed. This differs from the literature, which suggests that direct instruction was instrumental in developing a variety of critical thinking skills, including inferring, evaluating, and interpreting. In saying this, the majority of the participants from Survey 1 agreed that teaching the skill was something that should be pursued and that teachers need more training in how to explicitly teach students to critically think. This suggests that perhaps with more training, the teachers in our study would feel more strongly regarding how successful explicit teaching is in developing critical thinking skills. Additionally, a qualitative study that explores why some teachers disagree with using explicit teaching to teach critical thinking skills could potentially eliminate the gap in our knowledge.
Multiple explicit teaching practices can be implemented for future action research intervention. Following the teaching and learning cycle, planning and teaching are the next two steps to be conducted given the analysed information that has been discussed within this presentation. This follows the protocol of action research as the change that will be made into action for the unique circumstances of a teacher's classroom environment. The action research cycle dictates that when looking to future projects, what, where, who, how, and why should be addressed to ensure appropriate development. What? Changes to be made could include a focus group on explicit teaching practices at certain times of learning, such as at the start of lessons, start of topics, greater focus in lesson 1 of a 3-lesson development of a syllabus point, and when students are naturally more focused as early periods rather than period 5 on a Friday. Explicit teaching should be planned as a greater portion of lessons when teaching students of lower ability to ensure comprehension of the content, whereas more advanced students may benefit from a greater percentage of student-led, critical and creative designed authentic learning tasks that are less teacher-focused, facilitating student autonomy of learning. Consistent, timely, and corrective feedback is another important component of explicit teaching, which can be introduced by fortnightly topic tests as a formative assessment method, where students receive detailed feedback in addition to informing the teacher how well students are comprehending the content. Where, within the learning environment most appropriate to the content being learnt, typically the classroom, but for example, maybe in a school garden when learning about different flora types in science. Who, the style of implementation will be adjusted for students' optimal learning requirements, such as their cognitive ability, impacting the duration of direct teacher-led explicit teaching time during a lesson. How? Future implementations will require contextual analysis for optimal student outcome factors, such as current student engagement, school demographic, student behaviour, educational proficiency of students and the teacher. Why? This is important because as professionals, teachers need to be constantly upholding the ethics and values of their school, employer, and personal professional values. The Australian Professional Standards for Teachers more succinctly displays the need for action research in their 6th standard, Engage in Professional Learning, which is a requirement of maintaining an active teacher accreditation within New South Wales. Such professional development incorporates a significant potential for increased educational pedagogy designed for the unique learning context of the tested learning environment. The example displayed here is a 6-week action research plan for a Stage 5 unit of work where explicit instruction activity examples are provided in the table for the first 2 content descriptors. At the end of a 2-week period, students complete a formative assessment as learning activity that the teacher then reflects upon and analyses to make necessary planning modifications to the next 2-week cycle within the 2-week action research. This is so that the teaching and learning cycle is completed every 2 weeks to allow for teacher assessment, reflection, analysis, and planning for the following lessons to incorporate the teaching pedagogies that have appeared to be effective. Tentative plans may be created for future weeks, but the importance of action research is to develop upon the outcomes of the intervened action. Therefore, lesson plans for week 3 and 4 should not be completed until after the true analysis of students' weeks 1 and 2 formative assessment quiz. This example can be extended or shortened, but a minimum should include 4 weeks to ensure the quality of action research and cyclical progression.